All right, if you guys see the timeline just briefly with me, I want to remind you that we have covered pretty much all of the Pentateuch, which is right here at the beginning. And I emailed you guys this timeline already, so you should have a copy of that. And on that timeline, you're going to see that the Pentateuch comes at the very beginning with the dotted lines and then moves into the Genesis 12 through 50, and then Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We cover all the way to the conquest, which is the book of Joshua right here on this section, and then Judges. And what we're doing tonight, as you see the overlapping between 1st and 2nd Samuel with 1st Chronicles. That's what we're covering tonight, and moving forward into the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, and then 2nd Chronicles. So if you guys can, again, just follow me with your notes. You should have received those via email, and we're going to move into also this little section here, which is a united monarchy, and we're going to be talking about what is called wisdom literature. So that's also very important. So again, I want to kind of give you the framework where we are and what we're doing tonight. So hopefully that allows us to see more or less and connecting the dots on what we have done so far. But right now, let's move into 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And what I want to just take into account, once again, is the conversation that we've been having since the very beginning, which this is a selective theological history. And I guess for me, the concept of theology as the background of everything that we're saying, everything that we're doing is history. So is the concept that obviously God, as a missionary, is involved in everything that is taking place. Not that God approves everything that is taking place, but he is involved in everything that takes place. And yet the foundation of his involvement is always to reveal who he is. And this is why we say that it's a theological history. And in this case, the object of his involvement has been from day one, Judah. And this is by extending the parallel accounts in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then in 1st and 2nd Kings. So again, if you guys go back into briefly with me into the timeline, you're going to see the parallelism that we're talking about right here in front of you guys. The 1st and 2nd of Samuel, and then with Kings, and then Chronicles as well. And that's the reference that we're making in there. So you guys keep that in mind as we speak of that. On letter B, briefly, this was written for a post-exilic community. And I'm going to take you into the timeline in just a second. And here's what they are needing in this post-exilic community. They are in a desperate need to know that the covenant God was still their God. This is important. So if you're taking notes, this is one of the most crucial things that Dr. Bob is going to give us on that main truths of every book of the Bible. I say book of the Bible, but the commentaries. And by the way, I need to take you there briefly just to be reminded what are we doing, because this is a website. And when you come into the Old Testament survey, you click on that, and obviously we're in 1st and 2nd Chronicles right now. So when I take you to the book of Chronicles, let me see, which is right here. As you go into Chronicles, what I want to remind you is that I'm getting basically these notes from the introduction, and specifically I'm looking at that section of the bottom of the page, where he's got all these main truths from, this is the intro of the commentary. And I'm basically just putting all of that information into the PowerPoint, and that's what you guys are getting as well. So I want to remind you where the information is coming from. Those are Dr. Bob's notes on those commentaries. Let's come back to the letter B very quickly. So it was written for a post-exilic community. And again, I don't know if you guys have already make the connection with the timeline, but on the timeline, if you look at the post-exilic community after the exiles, as you guys know, number 6 right here, you have the fall of Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom, and this is the year 722. And then on number 7 right here at the bottom, you get the fall of Jerusalem, which is to the Babylonians. Right here, you see it on top, and that's the year 586. So they both go into exile, 2 different dates. What we're looking at on the screen right now is basically a community that is in the post-exilic, is after those exiles. And this is what we mean by post-exilic. Just looking at the timeline is basically this section that you see after the exile. And the message is basically for them to be reminded or to be confirmed, as you see on the notes, that they're in desperate need to know that the covenant God was still their God. This is so difficult to read because when I look at the confusion that they have, I don't minimize the struggles, the tragedy, the desperation, the suffering of these individuals. But you're going to remember that from day one, we have said that the covenants of God are conditional. And tragically, they violated the covenant, and God had no choice. God is a just God. And everything that God establishes, everything that God sets as part of that relationship, that covenantal relationship, must come to pass. And this is why, when it comes to these exiles, is nothing else but the reflection of the rebellion of this people, the people of God, but also the character of God reflected that he did not have a choice. He has to exercise his judgment, his justice in that regard. Now, when it comes to this understanding that they wanted to know whether the God of the covenant God was still their God, primarily was, and again, just thinking about their scenario, is because they felt the abandonment of God. We're fixing to go into the book of Job, and many of you remember, but the theology of these generations was basically when God was present, there was prosperity. When God was absent, then you get basically the curses, you get all this tragedy. So they're comparing, or they're processing the presence of God through their scenario. And once again, this is where we need to come back into our context today, because I get the impression that many of us, we kind of follow kind of the same mindset, that if things work together for the good of those who love him, I'm quoting Romans 8:28, then we kind of assume or get to the conclusion that God is for us and God is with us. And if things don't work together for our good, then we may feel that God is absent, or God is not real, or God lost, I guess, some sort of influence on what he said he was going to do. But the reality is that God is unchangeable. The reality, and again, going back into Romans 8:28, we have to remind ourselves that when Paul is speaking about this conversation of knowing, he's assuming that we know, and we know, right? So he assumes, I'm on Romans 8:28, he assumes that we know, this knowing that all things work together for good for those who love him. We have to be reminded that in the understanding of the God who is the object of the love, right? God is the object of knowing and the love. So we love God, those who love him. That implies that the perspective, the worldview or the understanding of God is that life is perceived through the immediate and through what is to come. And when we speak of the things that those who love God, all things work together for them, it has to be perceived through what is to come. So we do not minimize nor deny the suffering or the pain, whether it's this generation that we're speaking on in the book of Chronicles, or our generation when we go through the valley of the shadow and death. But we have to be reminded that we, through the understanding of who God is, the faithfulness of God, the character of God, is that we perceive, we process life, we process the immediate. I will call this the sensical, what is perceived with the senses. The sight, the smell, the touch, the hearing. We process that also through what is to come. And this is why we can make the assertion that everything that happens in this world serves and benefits those who love God through the lenses of what is to come. And then I guess the reverse is also true. For those who do not love God, who are lovers of themselves, people who do not know Christ, and they do not live for Jesus, everything good that happens to them, ultimately on what is to come, is going to serve as a curse, is going to serve as their demise and their judgment. So again, just remind yourself of these principles, because as we read these Old Testament statements, we have to process this through the lenses of the New Testament and eventually through the person of Jesus Christ. So I'll develop a little bit more on that in just a second. But I just want to remind you that the desperation is because this people are in the depth of suffering, in the depth, whether it's self-inflicted or someone else brought it into their lives. And by the way, when I talk about self-inflicted, just a quick, I guess, reminded on this principle. And I'm going to go back into the timeline. So I'm going to share that screen one more time. And I want to remind you that the timeline has all these world powers on top, from Egypt to Canaan to Philistia to Syria, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and then obviously we get into the end of the Old Testament. What I want to remind you is that God is going to utilize, and we're going to go deeper into that in the book of Job, but God is going to utilize these world powers, which they were not monotheistic, they were not lovers of the God, the one true God, they were pagan people, but God is going to utilize them to discipline the people of God. And I'm speaking of utilize them as in, and this is my point, is that suffering, evil, tragedy, always, and I said, I mean, I'm speaking of everything, including evil, suffering, tragedy, serves the purposes of God. Everything and everyone serves the purposes of God. But we are not implying that God approves or is in agreement to everything that happens, or that he finds joy when we go through the grief or through the valley of the shadow of death. But all that I'm saying, all that we're trying to imply, just by looking at this, once again, experience of this world powers, is that they're going to be instruments in the hands of God to serve God's purposes for his people. And again, I don't have all the answers nor all the intricacies, and I don't fully understand this entire concept of evil and suffering, but the reality is that these people, especially in the book of Chronicles, are in a lot of trouble. The temple, this is the next slide in there, since there was no king in this time in history, the temple is the focus for God's renewed covenant. Now, I'm going to remind you, the way God deals with his people from the beginning of time is through covenants. That's how God negotiates, and I use the word negotiates, but that's the way he deals with his people, through covenants. And this is why we're coming back into that the covenant was still conditional. That's the way it was from the very beginning. We call this covenant at the very beginning, we call it the covenant of works. Tragically, Adam is going to violate it, is going to break it from the very beginning. The consequences, the domino effect is going to come to us as well, as we know. And then the rest of the story, we know the rest of the story, right? How humanity, and we all are covenant breakers. The reality is that this covenant was still conditional. The implication that the condition is based on the obedience of God's Mosaic stipulations. Again, it's based on the law and people obeying, and that obedience that needs to be performed, that needs to be followed, and needs to be exercised. And here's some of the things that we got to remember. It primarily focuses on God's promises, this covenant to David and his sons, found in 2 Samuel chapter 7. So what we're going to see through this books and this narrative, historical narrative, whether it's Chronicles or Kings, and even 1st and 2nd Samuel, we're going to be reminded of these pillars of the faith, these amazing characters. And I want to take you back into how the story began, whether it is from Abraham to his seed or through his children, and then eventually through the nation. And obviously, we're speaking of kings such as David. The choosing of these individuals was to choose others. In other words, the election is always for the purpose to choose others. And this is important because tragically, if we're not careful, if we switch the focus from the God who is the provider of the covenant, who is the sustainer of the covenant, we learned that from Genesis chapter 15. Anytime that we shift the focus from God, the character of God, the person of God, the holiness of God, and by default, we place the focus on us. In this case, when you read that this is about David and his son, potentially we start looking at David or the people of God as VIP, as special because they are better or different. And that's not the case. These people, just like you and I, as followers of Jesus, they were chosen. We are chosen so others can be also a part of that salvation experience. We're simply vehicles for that redemption. We see that from Paul when he speaks of the ministry of reconciliation in the New Testament. Here's some of the uniqueness of this, again, covenantal promises given to David. Number one, deals exclusively with David's son and ultimately with King Messiah. So again, look at the lineage, look at the line through David for the purpose of bringing Again, the promise, right? The promised one. So we said before that in the Old Testament, the focus is on the land, on the real state, the promised land. In the New Testament is the seed that is coming. And in this case, you see that through King Messiah. It gives a positive account of the reigns of David, Solomon, and the godly kings of Judah. Again, I want to take you back into the timeline, because I'm switching back and forth on the timeline with you, because the godliness of the kings of Judah, the implication, you guys see the timeline, is that right here after the united monarchy, on that parenthesis, this is Samuel outside of the parenthesis. Then we have the three kings of the united monarchy, which is Saul, David, and Solomon. After Solomon, and again, we're going to get into those details in just a second, we're going to see the tragedy of covenant breakers. All right, Solomon, I mean, all of them are covenant breakers. All of us are. But specifically with Solomon, the situation gets to the place where God, again, exercises his justice, right? Justice. And the moment that he exercises justice, you see the splitting of the kingdom, which is what you're seeing on the screen. You see that instead of just one continuous line, it's going to go up, and you see this Israel line on top and Judah. The point that we're trying to make with what you see on the screen on the godly kings of Judah, in quotation marks, is basically because tragically on the northern kingdom, which is Israel, that's where you're going to see ungodliness to the deepest and rebellion. So keep that in mind, just again, to keep the conversation in the context and making the connection between the teaching that we find through this biblical commentaries from Dr. Bob and the timeline, which is also found on the website as well. Number 3, records the restorations of the Hebrews to Jerusalem by Cyrus II. And again, you see the biblical narrative where you find those in there. It stresses a future Davidic king, which is Messiah, right? It's coming into that restoration mindset. It's coming to that covenantal relationship that although it was conditional, what is unconditional is actually the covenant itself. I don't know if I'm making myself clear on that regard. The relationship with the covenant is conditional, but the covenant itself is unconditional. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that God is going to fulfill the covenant not because of the obedience of the people. God is going to fulfill the covenant because the covenant is based on his character. And what he promised was based on him. Obviously, that expression of how he based the covenant on him is reflected that eventually through this lineage, through a virgin young lady, is going to come Messiah. Jesus is going to be born, and he is obviously the fulfillment of that covenant. So again, that demonstrates that the covenant is unconditional, but the relationship, how is connected to the people, which are the recipients of that covenant, that is conditional. And that's why we're seeing all these violations, and tragically, it's not going to go well for them. One way this was accomplished was through the recording of the godly reigns, once again, of David, Solomon, and the godly kings of Judah. The messianic hope is also expressed in Zechariah and Malachi. There is also an emphasis, letter D, on all of God's people being united. This is important, because we come back into the universality of the gospel. I'm not talking about universalism. I'm speaking how the gospel from day one is for whosoever believes, right? So look at the concept of unity. And once again, when we speak of unity, and I'm going to come back to my timeline because I want to make sure that we're making sense over these principles, is because of the splitting of the kingdom that I just mentioned. So once again, you see the splitting of the kingdom, Israel on the north, 10 tribes, 2 on the south, which is Judah and Benjamin. So that splitting of the kingdom, what we're seeing through this covenantal renewal is the possibility of utilizing this language of this emphasis on unity. This is seen by the use of the collective term, all Israel. So there's some sort of a wordplay through the Old Testament, especially after the kingdom is divided, and it's basically that sometimes, and I'm thinking of the book of Amos right now, sometimes the Bible uses the word Israel to refer to the northern kingdom. But sometimes, just like what we're saying right now, it uses the word Israel to refer to the entire people of God, meaning all the tribes, all the Jewish people. You obviously have to look at the context to know which one is which, whether he's talking about northern kingdom or the entire community of the people of God. Here are just the biblical references on all this, emphasis on unity that they're hoping to have. The genealogies used in this book of Chronicles has to do like those in Ezra and Nehemiah. The purpose is to show the restored nation of Israel is legitimate in that they are the legitimate people of all Israel, meaning before the splitting of the kingdom, before the fall of all this, northern kingdom to the Assyrians, and then southern kingdom to the Babylonians. They want to make sure that they're going back into who they were prior to all these tragedies that they went through. To summarize the history of the Hebrews back to Adam, they're trying to come back and reconnect the dots, again, establish themselves into the promises of God. So again, I don't know where we are today, or where you might find yourself today, individually, family-wise, society-wise. But one of the things that, and I don't remember who I talked to about this, but I was speaking to someone recently, and just seeing the constant shifting of our surroundings and experiences and life, and obviously COVID changes a whole lot of these things. When I read this notes from Dr. Bob, and I'm processing the material for our conversation tonight, I couldn't help but I'm thinking of how diverse our culture is. And I'm thinking of the book of Ephesians, where a lot of these churches in the New Testament, one of the major challenges that has to do with the confusion theologically and doctrinally is exactly because of diversity that is within them, whether it's ethnically, culturally, all this, this is the epicenter of the world, what we're talking about back in those days. And Paul in Ephesians, what he's going to do, he's going to remind the church in Ephesus, or this house churches, potentially house churches in this modern day Turkey, that the ideal or the goal is not uniformity. It's not for Jewish people to be like Gentile people, or for Roman people to be like Greeks. And that's not the mindset. That's not what the gospel does, or that's the goal of the gospel. But Paul is going to introduce through the first 3 chapters of Ephesians to remind them of this forensic unity, which is the unity of the triune God. Paul is going to go into this theological teaching, reminding them that this is a unity that has nothing to do with the church or with you and I. It's the unity of the God of the Bible, the triune God, and then obviously gets into the transition of what that looks like and implies for those who follow the God of the Bible, for those who are a part of the community that is based and founded on this, again, forensic unity of the triune God. And what Paul comes into the conclusion in Ephesians, which I want to take it into this understanding of why they're going and trying to go back into make sure that they are reminded that we are the Israel of old, that we are connected in the history of the Hebrews back to Adam, is because Paul is going to remind us in Ephesians that what God does, what the gospel does, it takes our uniqueness and allows us to celebrate those uniqueness, instead of when the gospel is disregarded or is compromised, because that was the problem of these churches. They were negotiating the gospel and there was doctrinal confusion. In this scenario, what you guys see on the screen is that they negotiated the covenant, obviously, the gospel, right? In a sense that they negotiated obedience. They negotiated, the oneness of the one true God, in a sense of that exclusive worship to the God of the Bible. And because of that, when that happens, which is the case in Ephesians, again, the uniqueness we start, and this is what we do today, our uniqueness, whether it's a skin color, language preferences, gender, or whatever the case may be, those uniqueness, we start idolizing them and eventually exalting them. And they become literally the obstacles to connect and to relate to one another. What the gospel does, without losing those uniqueness, we celebrate them because we submit them. We submit the uniqueness. We submit our personal preferences, our theological biases, and our personal experiences. They're submitted to that unity that he describes in chapters 1 through 3, which is the fullness, which is the sovereignty, which is the God who, again, Paul in Ephesians speaks of predestination, which is, again, the mercy of God, speaks of how he has literally united everything back to him. So I don't know if I'm making any, my explanation makes or connects to the dots that we're trying to put into the what's on the screen, because once again, the issue is that they're trying to come back into the celebration of their uniqueness as the people of God. It has been negotiated. I mean, they're in exile. They're suffering. They're going through all this. The temple has been destroyed, and they're going back to how the whole story began, with no identity. They're confused. They don't know exactly where to go and what to do. And this is where they're questioning whether the God of the Bible, their covenant God, is still their God. And I believe that this is exactly what's happening in the book of Ephesians and a lot of these churches in the New Testament. And the answer, I don't believe it was for them, nor was for the people in Ephesus or for us. I don't think the answer is to look introspectively. I don't think the answer is for us to simply try to get along with each other and, find common grounds or, cohesiveness. I think the answer, unity within the people of God and unity in this world, is not something that we achieve. It's something that happens to us. It's something that the supernatural power of the Holy Spirit does in the life of the believer. That's the bottom line when it comes to this unity. And these people are gonna walk into that and try to find that. And even as we move into the book of Esther, Esther is that book that is going to exemplify that leadership, that coming back into a forensic unity, a forensic covenant, the God of the covenant, who is not them. They are not, salvation is not through the people of God, in a sense that they are not salvation. Salvation, flows, comes out of the presence of God. And this is why Esther, Nehemiah, they continue the history of the post-exilic Persian period, and this is where Second Chronicle ends. So again, I hope you guys are reading the screen on this Ezra and Nehemiah and using the language of the post-exilic, because I'm going to take you back into the timeline. On the timeline, I'm going to say that again. This is the post-exilic. Here's the exile between 7 and 8, and then you guys see this entire section, which is the post-exilic. And this is where you see Ezra, and this is where you see Nehemiah also operating right here under Ezra. And Ezra 1 through 6 is right here at the beginning, between 8 and 9. And then over here on top, you see Esther, you see prophets such as Obadiah, Joel, Haggai, Zechariah, and then at the very end is Malachi. So again, I'm just trying for us to connect the dots when it comes to the chronology, when it comes to where is it that these notes are taking us into the flow of the history of Israel. It shows the racial validity, once again, the seed of Abraham, of the returning exiles by the following. This is how they're coming back into, again, reconnect, retake that relationship. Because again, remember, in the Old Testament, the focus is going to be on the land, which has been taken because of the exiles, and then also in a sense of the nation, the people, the Jewish people, right? Those are kind of the two primary focuses in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, as we said, that land and this people group are simply the vehicle for the coming of Messiah, the coming of the seed of the woman, right? Which is salvation in the person of Jesus Christ. So in this case, because this is Old Testament, they're trying to remind themselves and make them reconnect to that promises, that covenant that was made, in this case, to Abraham, and then through the lineage. Here are the things: the extensive tribal genealogies. It is the way it's going to be quoted in Ezra and Nehemiah, and then the extensive Levitical list. Number 3, the religious exclusivism of the returnees in relation to the offer of help by the surrounding Persians. So again, they're trying to come back to rediscover, again, I guess, again, and I'm just thinking about the diversity. I'm thinking about our current churches and our current ministries. We get the privilege to serve through Texas Baptist, and we go to multiple places and multiple churches. And one of the phenomena that you see in Texas among Baptist churches, and I'm sure other denominations, they're no exception to this, is you see the diversity in churches, but also you see I don't know what word to use. I don't know if the correct word is cohabitation, but is the sharing of buildings in multiple congregations. So they coexist, they co-worship in that. And some of these churches are thinking about joining, merging. Some of them have merged, and some of us, we have been a part of mergers in the past. But here's the point: all of this diversity, based on what I said earlier, and again, look at the screen, they're trying to come back and retake those non-negotiables. My argument has been, and my recommendation, and my thinking, as we look at generational, diversity, meaning, we have your older generation, middle-aged generation, the younger generation, whatever you may find yourself in that diversity. What the gospel does, as I said, is the gospel allows us to celebrate the uniqueness, but here's the bottom line. What the gospel allows you to do, what the diversity allows you, God in the context of diversity is for us to come back to the non-negotiables, to the foundations of gospel presentation. In other words, we can talk sociologically, we can talk anthropology, and we can talk about men and the uniqueness, and we can talk about, our heritage and where we came from and where we are and what we're hoped to do. All of those conversations are legit. I'm not against those conversations. But since we are going through a lot of changes, and this seems to continue to change, meaning our world, our families, our ministries, the recommendation, just like these people who are trying to come back to what decision-making, can we just come back to this gospel presentation? And this is why last week we invested a lot of our time in speaking of this issue, is that, our preaching and our teaching of the scriptures, our encounter with the Bible cannot continue to be focused on the disciplines, on the things that we need to do, the things that we have to do, the things that we're called to do, the things that we want to change, achieve, or maybe move from, change of behavior and mindsets. I think those things are important for them to happen, especially when they are done based on the scriptures. But we cannot continue to be teaching and preaching all this behavior modification. The disciplines of the church, the disciplines of the people of God must be based, and this is what we need to begin the conversation. This is what they're trying to do. They need to come back to doctrine. Preaching, teaching of the Bible is founded not on the needs that people have. The teaching and the preaching of the Bible is founded on doctrine, is based on what God has said. That's where everything begins. So typically what we typically say that the text determines the sermon, not the scenario, not my experience, not what I'm going through or what I hope to go through or what I understand, the situation looks like. Again, I'm not against what's taking place. I'm not against what you have gone through, I'm going through. All of those things are legit and they're important, but their importance is based on what is eternal, on what is authority, which in this case is the scriptures, And I'm bringing this up because, again, as much as we might feel, and I know we do feel overwhelmed with changes and scenarios, and some of these experiences are not very positive, what is taking place in our culture. Some of them are beautiful. So I'm not going to deny it. God is a God who continues to bless, the righteous and the wicked and all that. I understand that. But we cannot continue to approach the scriptures to see what God is going to tell me. No, I think we approach the scriptures based on what God has said, and based on what he has said, now I look into what does that mean? How can I apply that into my scenario and my understanding? So again, as pastors and Bible teachers, Sunday school teachers, small group leaders, whatever the case may be, as followers of Jesus, I'm going to say this again. Please, let's go after doctrine. Let's make sure that our generation knows how to articulate, not necessarily personal testimony. Nothing wrong with personal testimony, but this is about the testimony of the God of the Bible. This is about the testimony of what God promised that he would do, what he promised about his character, about himself. All right, so all of that based on Esther and Nehemiah, that God has reestablished, what is it? The covenant, right? He reestablished the covenant with the descendants of the patriarchs. However, this is not the new covenant. And we'll get to those prophets within the next few weeks as we look at the new covenant of Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36. All right, so both Ezra and Nehemiah, they document reoccurrences of the same sins that caused the exiles. So they're going to document those things. They're going to come back and remind them what is it that created this, separation, this confusion, this self-inflicted pain and suffering that people are going through in these days. God's continuing love and faithfulness to his promises is highlighted. So I want you to see the contrast. From one end, and I'm speaking from the preaching, the teaching of the scriptures, because that's what Ezra and Nehemiah are doing. They're reintroducing, again, the law, right? They're not beginning. Ezra and Nehemiah, they are not reintroducing, or they are not preaching the 3 steps on how to come out of the exile. What they're doing is that they're reintroducing what actually brought them into exile. And what brought them into exile was the forgetfulness, was the violation of the law, was the disobedience to what God has said. That's where the problem resides. So now what they're doing, they're coming back, and Ezra and Nehemiah, they're going to reintroduce not a better future for them, not a better scenario. They're reintroducing what God has said, which in this case is the law. And this is why, based on God's covenantal relationship, that is what we're saying, God's continuing love and faithfulness to his promises. That although you are going through the valley of the shadow and death, although you are in the middle of exile, although you're going through abuse and the loss is irreversible and everything seems to be pretty much going downhill, here is the bottom line. Here's what the gospel, here's what doctrine says, is that God continues because he's faithful. He is the concept of Hesed, this everlasting love, this love that doesn't change, is the God that his love and his faithfulness, he is faithful, to his promises. And those are the things that they're going to highlight. So again, I don't know if you can see that from this spiritual leaders, this men chosen by God to reintroduce doctrine, not necessarily just to change disciplines. I don't know if that's clear. All right. Again, Ezra and Nehemiah, they're not in the business of reintroducing or changing the disciplines of the people of God, the worship and all those things. I think that is going to eventually come out of the covenant, out of the law. They're reintroducing the law. And anytime that the law doctrine is presented, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but I hope and you guys are taking notes. Anytime that doctrine is reintroduced, or maybe introduced for the first time, the first thing that the law, the doctrine, that the word of God does is going to expose the sins of the people. So we typically say that the good news of the gospel, that's what the law is, that's what the scriptures is, the good news of the gospel begins with bad news. Otherwise, if we do not speak of the rebellion and the sin that the law exposes, we're going to look at the scriptures, or we're going to continue looking at the scriptures the way these people were and the way that we typically do, going to the Bible to find out what to do with my situation, what to do. Once again, we go to the Bible to find or to improve or to tweak, my disciplines, because it's all about my commitment to the Lord, my calling, to the Lord, my failures, whatever. It's all about what I think and how I feel. And that's exactly where the problem resides, because we're fixing to go, especially in the book of Job, Dr. Bob is going to remind us over and over and over again that the central character of the Bible is God. It's not man. It's not the church of Jesus. It's not the people of God. It's God. And the only way that the people of God are going to be reminded who God is when we preach the Bible. Instead of going to the Bible to see what do I do now that I'm fixing, that I'm going through, that I'm feeling, that I'm, anyways, I don't know if I'm making myself clear on that. But again, it begins with bad news, and the bad news introduces the beautiful news of the God of the Bible, although things are, again, damaged, although there is loss, although in the immediate, going back to Romans 8:28, although in the sensical, in the immediate, things are not working for the good. Right now, I don't feel that they're working for the good. And yet, the scriptures, not my condition, the scriptures, not my experience, the scriptures, not my sensical reality, the immediate, reminds me. This is what Nehemiah and Esther are doing, is that they're reminding them that God continues through love and faithfulness, because you were unfaithful. They're telling them, you were unfaithful. The faithfulness of God exposes the unfaithfulness of his people. And this is not easy to read, nor is it to preach. I mean, this is why it's a lot easier simply to get up there and open the Bible or speak to people and talk about how God loves everybody and how God is giving you a much better, or misquote Romans 8:28, because I believe Romans 8:28 is probably the most famous verse in the Bible. Everybody quotes it. Everybody puts it on on social media and coffee cups or whatever, mugs or whatever. I'm telling you, we have to be reminded that the faithfulness of God is based on God's character. And there is no way to know the character of God outside of the Bible. There's no way. And this is why we're committed to preach the Bible, preach the scriptures. Let the text define the teaching. Let the text define the sermon. Let the text define what do we do with the unfaithfulness, with the loss, with the joy, with the promises, with the dreams, with the desires, with the questions, with the wondering. What do we do with that? Let the text define that. And that's exactly what these brothers are doing. So what we see here with those promises, which are going to be highlighted, is that even the covenant people to love and to obey God is also highlighted. It shows the development of a new pattern of worship. Now we're moving into the disciplines, right? Again. So the disciplines, what do we do? How do we face this? It's there. And so you don't have, nobody is more in favor, or nobody is more in agreement in a sense of seeing obedience and seeing those disciplines being exercised than the God of the Bible. I'm saying this because a lot of people today, tragically, when they hear the word doctrine, they automatically think of boring or irrelevant, or again, I'm looking for a church that is practical, that tells me what to do, and then hopefully makes me want to do it, whatever that may be. I'm telling you, just listen to this. It's going to show the development of a new pattern of worship. So now we're moving into this is what you do, right? The disciplines, which focuses on the local synagogue and scribes. This, of course, was not the exclusion of the temple worship in Jerusalem. Esther, as a person, is a great example of a spiritual leadership to be emulated. And I'm going to say that again. I take nothing away from these leaders, nothing away from this season of their lives and their ministries, which were not easy to rebuild, to reestablish, and reintroduce doctrine. But I'm telling you, everything they did was based exclusively on that experience to come back and bring these people not to become a better version of themselves, but they brought him back into the experience of facing the God of covenants, the character of God, the holiness of God, the righteousness of God. All right, let's move briefly into Nehemiah. Nehemiah, some of you are very fond of Nehemiah. Definitely am. A lot of these books are just worthy of studying, and go through the book. Just do a Bible study, do a sermon series on some of these books, and I promise you, this is just beautiful to see the God of covenants exercising His promises through the leadership of these amazing men and women in this time in history. This book continues the history which began in Chronicles and Ezra. I don't know if I need to put the timeline again on the screen, but again, if you can just reconnect and put the dots together on that regard. They document the reestablishment. They document the reestablishment of doctrine. I don't know how to emphasize this. Again, the disciplines, the practices, the habits, the uniqueness of the Jewish people and the worship patterns, they're going to overflow of the reestablishment of what was violated, which was the covenant. So he's reestablishing that covenant in the context of that community and in the promised land. Because obviously this is the returning people, right? Those are the ones coming after the exiles. As Ezra was concerned with the spiritual covenantal life of the new community, Nehemiah was concerned with, so here's the contrast. Ezra, his concern was with the spiritual covenantal life. He's reintroducing the gospel. He's reintroducing, again, the law, talking about Ezra. Nehemiah is using that foundation that Ezra reintroduced in place, which again, that's my suggestion, my invitation. That's how we do preaching and teaching of the Bible. We deal with the doctrine. And then look what happens as the overflow. The overflow is that the protective wall around the city, we go into the disciplines, we go into, this is what it means, this is what we do in our context. Here's the quote unquote, the practical section, okay? The administrative aspect of the city. However, Nehemiah is as spiritual and faithful as Ezra was. Because once again, because disciplines must be built and founded in doctrine. And let me say this, just as a side note or a quick parenthesis. Anytime that doctrine doesn't take you into disciplines, anytime that doctrine doesn't take you into action and obedience and surrendering, and again, Christ-likeness, sanctification, holiness, anytime that doctrine doesn't take you there, something is wrong with the doctrine. We're preaching the wrong doctrine. We're compromising the doctrine of God. Because what the Bible does, the Bible always results into lifestyle. The way Dr. Bob typically puts it is that doctrine is always relational. It always moves you into the aspect of community. It moves you into the understanding of who you are in the context of the larger picture of life, family, church, community, and ultimately the world. You know, the Great Commission, the Great Commandment. So again, I'm saying all this because if we're struggling to find the application, that what does it mean? How do I help my son and my daughter now that, you know, my grandma is going through whatever? I'm telling you, maybe the issue is not that we don't know what to tell them or how do we process this. The issue is that potentially, we have been, I don't know, indoctrinated, maybe discipled with a mindset that the Bible is simply like a crystal ball that just tells me what to do. Just it's like a phone book, you know, yellow pages of a phone book. And I know I'm dating myself with that comment, but just tell me what to do with my life. And again, eventually you're going to see the leadership of this man telling the people what to do, but it's based on the God of covenant. It's based on the character of God, which is revealed through the law. Again, Nehemiah is as spiritual, as faithful as Ezra. Both trust in Yahweh and his presence, power, and plan. Both Ezra and Nehemiah are concerned with covenant fidelity, doctrine, right? I'm going to say it again. That's their main concern. The people of God, they need to come back, not to be the Jewish of all people, not to be, you know, I mean, yeah, they're trying to reconnect and reestablish some of the systems that were lost because of the exile, some of the things that Moses, through the law, and God, through, you know, time, established, and principles, and all that kind of stuff. But it's going to be based on doctrine. It's going to be based on the scriptures. It's going to be based on the covenant. And again, they are concerned about this covenant fidelity. They're not concerned about behavior modification. They're not concerned about people not going back and do what they used in the past. They're concerned about understanding that it's not what we do, is who we do it against too. In this case, you know, when we break the law, it's not simply the breaking of the law. It's not simply the self-inflicted, you know, rebellion, pain, and the consequences, how we, you know, damage and break relationships. All of that is tragic. But the reality, when it comes to this covenant fidelity, is that not only that we create all this dysfunctionality in our midst, but it's also the fact that we are being rebellious against the God of the Bible. And history, especially for them, immediate history shows them, tells them that it's not going to go well if they continue to be unfaithful to doctrine. So again, I'm speaking as a pastor because I love the church, and I am a pastor, and I'm a fellow struggler. If our people today, if our families are going to be unfaithful, if we're going to be unfaithful, I want to make sure that we are unfaithful to the Bible versus just to versions or mockeries of the Bible. Because if you look at the screen, again, their concern is covenant fidelity. Their concern is not that they finished the wall. The concern is not that they reestablished practices and habits and disciplines. All of that is the overflow of the scriptures. But I think leadership from a pastoral, from a spiritual component, as a father of three, we got three kids. For some of you who are grandparents, if or when our generation, our kids, they choose to rebel against the Lord. And I said, if and when, because I'm not predicting that. But if that ever happens and they rebel against the Lord, we have to make sure that when they rebel, they fully understand that they're rebelling against the covenant of God, the God of the covenant. And I'm saying this because as long as we continue to preach and to teach disciplines at the expense of doctrine, this is what we need to do. This is what you don't do. This is why you behave this way, at the expense of not knowing the scriptures, which if you don't know the scriptures, you don't know the God of the scriptures. When that's the scenario, my argument has been and will continue to be that potentially what people are rebelling against is a caricature of God. It's a mockery of God. And this is why we're in a time and age that I believe that we need to come back and reintroduce the gospel. And some of you remember this, but the gospel is precisely what God has done, going back to covenant fidelity, is what God has done, being faithful to what he has said without our help. God was faithful, has been faithful, will continue to be faithful, and we contributed nothing. That's the gospel. The gospel is not that we finally understood and we finally, got it and came back and our disciplines changed. No, that is the result of the gospel. That is not the gospel. The gospel is what God has done, which in this case is faithfulness. Is the same God, is the same God of the covenant, and he has done without our help. The sins of the people of God, except for idolatry, are continued in the post-exilic community. In the post-exilic books, God is present, but not visually, physically confirmed. And again, God's will is seen through decisions of pagan kings and thwarting of local opposition. God's presence is a matter of faith and obedience. His word, the Torah, becomes key, right? Doctrine is what God has said. All right, let me take a quick break. Questions, comments, talk to me. Has anybody spoken or shared anything on the chat? I don't know if you guys have done that, but I love to hear from you guys. What is happening? I know it's a lot of information. We're trying to go through this as quick as we can. It's a survey course, so this moves fast, quick. And again, part of the assignment is to watch Dr. Bob's videos where he goes into detail. I'm just giving you kind of an overview of that. How are we doing? Are we guys okay? No comments, no suggestions, questions on this? All right, let me move into the next thing. Feel free to put things on the chat and we'll dialogue over anything that you guys might see through some of these notes that we're covering tonight. Esther, just briefly over Esther, it was an encouragement to faithfulness to God during times of persecution. I'm gonna say that again. It was an encouragement, and again, we're describing, the truths that we find in the book of Esther. It was an encouragement to faithfulness to God, based on the faithfulness of God. Again, and I'm sorry, I know I'm repeating myself, but if you notice, the gospel is just basically the repetition of the same message, isn't it? I mean, there's no different gospel. I mean, what else can I preach? What else can we teach? I want to listen to this again. The encouragement to faithfulness to God. So faithfulness to God, I will describe that as discipline, is what we do in response to the God who is faithful. So the God who is faithful is basically the doctrine. When you preach the Bible, when you go to the Bible, when you encounter the Bible, what you're going to find is exactly the opposite. You're going to find the people who are unfaithful. That's what you find in the Bible. But the unfaithfulness of the people is filtered, is processed through the faithfulness of God. And I'm saying this because what you're going to see in Esther is that encouragement to be faithful, to be disciplined, to change your ways, to change your mind, to change your heart. But that is the supernatural work of the God who is faithful. So God is faithful. That will be doctrine. That will be the encounter with the word, the written word. we're New Testament people, or post-New Testament, in a sense that we're reading this through the lenses of the New Testament and through the lenses of the resurrection of Jesus. So obviously, this faithfulness of God is described through history and is described and eventually takes us into the fulfillment of that promises, that faithfulness in the person of Jesus Christ. How faithful has been God, or was God with us? God was so faithful that he not only kept his promises, but his faithfulness was such that when we were unfaithful, he took our place. When we were unfaithful, when we prostituted ourselves and we went after other gods and deities, and we worship ourselves, and we were led by what we felt, and we were defined by our inclination and personal preferences, or whatever the case may be, on what happened to me or what I did. Anytime that we fell into those, that's exactly where we're coming from. God not only remained the same, and his covenant remained the same, but he also took our place. So Paul says in Corinthians that the one who knew no sin for our sake became sin. So in this case, once again, it was an encouragement, talking about Esther, it was an encouragement in times of persecution, especially for those who are or remain in exile. It clearly demonstrates God's guiding hand in history, the faithfulness of God, right? Not only of Israel, but also to those people who are not even within the covenantal relationship, because that's exactly the universality of that gospel, right? So the covenant that we have with the God of the Bible is so others can be also part or get engaged into that covenantal relationship. The absence of any name of God in the book of Esther and any reference to the normal Jewish spiritual practices, except an allusion to fasting and prayer, was a literary foil to emphasize God's mysterious influence and guidance of all human history. Once again, he doesn't panic. God is not going through a season of confusion or wondering. The God of the Bible remains the same throughout all generations. All right. This is where we were supposed to end last week. I want to just utilize the time the remaining of my time. I got a few minutes left before we close our time together. And again, I don't know if you guys have any questions or comments on that. Put them on the chat for me, and we'll look at them in just a second. But let's go into one of the most extensive teachings that Dr. Bob has in his commentary. And man, this is extensive. I don't know if you guys had a chance to look at the book of Job. And obviously, this is a central, foundational, theological book in the entire Bible, which, by the way, what I want to do with this before I take you to the notes, I want to come back into our timeline. And this is the reason why I want you to contextualize this book of Job. Come back into the beginning right here with Genesis, and then again, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. I want you to see where Genesis 12:50 is, and look at the character. Look at Job, where he's found in the timeline, in this chronological setting that we're looking at. So this patriarchal era, I want you to look at that and be reminded where we are as we describe some of these principles. Again, I hope you guys find it helpful as we navigate some of these things. All right, let's talk about this for a second, okay? This book is really about the wonder of wonders. It's about doctrine. It's about the character of God, right? Come on, let's just say it together, right? Doctrine first, disciplines second. I'll say that again. Doctrine first, discipline seconds. We got to find out first who God is so we can find out who we are, and then eventually realize or figure out what to do. I'm saying that again. Let's find out who God is first. This is why the book is really about God. Unless we know who God is, we will never know who we are. Therefore, we will not know what to do. Tragically, a lot of preaching in the Western Hemisphere, in our culture, in our surroundings, focuses on what to do, focuses on imperatives, focuses on this is what you got to do, this is what you need to go, this is what you need to sacrifice, this is what you need to obey, this is why you need to change your ways. I'm telling you guys, especially when you go through an experience like this brother, Job, I'm telling you, your disciplines and your desires and your giftedness and your qualities and your uniqueness will not be enough. And you know why they will not be enough? Because you are not inspired. You might be illumined. You might be, again, I'm not questioning salvation. I'm not questioning calling. All that I'm saying is that God only takes responsibility based on what he said about himself, demonstrated through his character, incarnated in the person of Jesus, and fulfilled through the obedience of Jesus. The beauty of this conversation, the beauty of these principles is that everything that I just gave you, everything that I just said has been given, imputed, transferred, accredited to the church. So it's pretty obvious that the church must go, must obey. The church must follow. Those are non-negotiables. The question is not whether we're going to obey or not. The question is whether we're going to obey because our obedience is based on the obedience of Jesus, on the character of God, on what God has said. So in this case, once again, the book is about the character of God. The discussion is addressed through the mysterious nexus of, and again, here's where we get into the mystery, into the things that he's going to present. A good, all-powerful God. Here's the mystery. A good, all-powerful God. The consequences of a fallen world. Okay, all have sinned, and we have fallen short of the glory of God. Here's the mystery. Number 3, the Mosaic performance-based covenant, which is described as the 2 ways. We're going to talk about in just a second what that implies. And here are the references of the 2 ways, the blessings and the curses, right? That's what it means with the 2 ways, the blessings and the curses of this covenantal performance-based covenant relationship. The real issue is, here's a real issue, you taking notes. The real issue is, can we trust Yahweh? Can we trust God in the midst of life's crooked path, which implies human suffering? That's kind of the central question of the book. That's the central question, I believe, of our culture and our generation. Can we trust God? So a couple of implications about this question. One of the implications I will say is that trust or faith is unavoidable. We will trust or we will faith, I'm using faith as a verb, we will faith or trust someone or something. If the answer to this last question or this real issue, if the answer is no, I cannot trust God. If the answer is simply a rebellious or maybe a confusing no or yes, or maybe partially, which partial trust in God is no trust. I don't know if that's already understood. Are you guys with me on that one? Yeah? No? Yes? There's no way you can partially trust God. It's a contradiction of term. It's like a carnal Christian. Have you heard that term before, carnal Christian? That's a contradiction of terms. Anyways, all right, my point is this. If the answer of, if I'm making the choice not to trust God, by default, I think you're trusting self. And if you, again, I don't know if you're old enough, but I'm old enough to know that I'm not a reliable person. I'm my number one thread to my own joy, because again, I live in a culture and I live in an environment where 80% of the suffering or the scars in my soul have been self-inflicted, because I trusted. I going back to Romans 8:28. I trusted. I made decisions based on the immediate. I kept on forgetting what is to come, the ultimate. That's what I'm trying to say. So when the answer to this question, can I trust God in the midst of life's craziness, brokenness, sinfulness, rebellion, again, fallen world, when you deal with that question, what God allows you to do when you put your trust in his trustworthiness, what he allows you to do is not necessarily to become immune from the crookedness of this world, from the consequences of sin and rebellion. What God allows you to do, which is going to be dealt with Job, is he's going to give you the ability, I will argue the supernatural ability, because faith, trust is a gift, right? It's a gift that comes from God. It gives you the ability to process life, the good, the bad, and the ugly, through the ultimate, not just through the immediate. Through the ultimate instead of just the immediate. And I'm saying this because a lot of things that are happening in this world, a lot of things that will happen to you and to me will not make sense. They will not. They will not. A lot of things that will happen to Job and to the people of God, whether it was self-inflicted or somebody else caused it, whatever the case may be, whatever their source was, there's a point in that moment where you're going to have to come to the realization that this is not making sense. This is why we understand that faith or trust includes the senses, but is beyond the senses. I'm going to say that again. Faith, trust includes, so you have to know what you believe and why you believe it. But eventually, it's going to go beyond just simply knowing what I know or having a way to explain what I know. There's a point in the conversation where it's going to go beyond the senses. This is what I'm using the language of the immediate and the ultimate, the immediate and what is to come. Because this is when we trust that although I am going through, again, human suffering, I'm going through what I never thought I will ever face, even though this is real, even though the damage is irreversible, even though she's not here, he is not here, even though the betrayal happened, whatever the case may be, you process life through what is to come. Now, again, this is a lot easier to speak and to process when you are looking at this from a theological, doctrinal, historical perspective. But when you're facing it, Lord have mercy. That's a different conversation, isn't it? That's a different conversation. And this is why, as important as it is for you and I to trust, as important as it was for this brother Job to trust, as important as it is, and it was for the people of God in the Old Testament to trust, I'm going to say this very clearly. Trust is extremely important. Trust is part of the covenantal relationship. Trust is the way that we are able to get into that covenantal. But the most important thing about our trust is the object of the trust. Is the bigness of God, is the reliability of God, is the trustworthiness of God, is the faithfulness of God, is simply who God is. And I'm going to say this one more time. There is no way that we can know how reliable and how trustworthy God is outside of the scriptures. There is no way we can know that. It is literally revealed through the scriptures. Obviously, I'm speaking of the written scriptures or the written word, but I'm ultimately speaking of the word made flesh, which is Jesus Christ. Anyways, I'm bringing this up to us again, because here's where each protagonist has a significant role in the literary structure and development of the theme of the book. So is from a literary perspective, every one of these individuals that are going to play a part in the narrative of Job, they are building into this specific question, this specific theme. And here's what we must remember. Here are some key factors that we got to remember as we process the book of Job. Number one, this is hard to read. The fall of Genesis 3, the rebellion, the cosmic treason that our father, Adam, first Adam, committed. This is not the world God intended to be. However, the New Testament theme is not developed in the Old Testament or the rabbis. In other words, here's the implication. The contrast and progressive aspect, the contrast and the progressive aspect of the performance-based Mosaic covenant. So again, you got the covenant, you got the law, which is based on performance, is based on obedience, is based on the things that we are called to do, versus the new covenant, which is based not on our obedience. No, is not based on our performance, but is based on the performance and the obedience of Jesus. This is extremely important, because we have to see the distinctiveness. And again, folks, I'm not going to apologize, but I'm just going to say it over again. The obedience of Jesus, the performance of Jesus, right here, what you see here, see, the new covenant, which is found in the performance-based obedience, faithfulness of Jesus, right? And then here you have all these references for Jesus. Please hear me say this. The obedience of Jesus, the performance of Jesus, the character of Jesus, the person of Jesus, the lifestyle of Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, that's what is described as doctrine. Because everything is based on Jesus. It's not based on us. And I'm saying this because once again, and I'm just drilling this point over and over and over and over and over again, because it's not working. As long as we continue to preach a gospel that is based on my performance and my obedience and my resilience and my sincerity and my honesty and my knowledge and mine, I'm telling you, I will argue that's exactly the opposite of the encounter that we need with the person of Jesus. See, everything that God has given us in a sense of that performance base, hear me say this closely because I don't want to confuse anybody. I want to make sure that the message is clear tonight, especially when you navigate through the book of Job. Once we recognize that the centrality of the gospel is the obedience, the character, the life, the death, the resurrection, the worldview, the feelings, the theology, the doctrine of Jesus. Once we realize that has nothing to do with us, has nothing to do with me, that's the gospel. Once we realize that, then and only then, now we move into the performance base, meaning now we obey, now we focus on the disciplines, now we focus on obedience, now we focus on the things that we need to do. Why? Watch this. Because once you're saved, once you encounter the fullness, the wholeness, the person of Jesus, once that happens, now we're saved for the law. So the law has always been relevant. The law has always been valid and effective. Simply that the law was not given so we can be saved. The law was given so we can be reminded that you cannot be saved by your own performance. But once you're saved by the performance of Jesus, now you're saved for performance. Now you're saved to obey. Now you're saved to actually do what the Bible says, which in this case is from Genesis all the way through Revelation. Now, obviously, the disclaimer is always that there's some descriptive components and there's some prescriptive components, right? And you guys know that language. Sometimes the Bible is just telling you what happens, and sometimes it's telling you what always happens. Now, hear me say this. Once we're saved by the person of Jesus and we're saved to obey, here's probably the most, and I said the most important, but everything is important. Hear me say this. Once we're saved and we're saved to perform, to obey, to surrender, to grow, to disciplines, hear me say this. That obedience is not our obedience. It's the obedience of somebody else given, transferred, imputed, accredited to us. This is the reason why Jesus had to live, not just die for our sin. If Jesus only dies for us and he doesn't live for us, then we're in big trouble because we're going to go back into trying. In other words, if Jesus only dies for us, but he doesn't live for us, 33 years of life in obedience, if he only dies, he can only provide innocence, forgiveness of sins. But you and I know that forgiveness of sins is not enough. Forgiveness of sins is not enough. Forgiveness of sins is what happens on Friday. But what happens on Sunday when he comes out of the graveside is him, Jesus, imputing, Jesus accredited, Jesus transferring all of his performance, all of his obedience of his life. So now that we are saved, now that we are walking in righteousness, again, we're walking in righteousness because forgiveness is not enough. We need to be righteous, made right with God. And again, that righteousness implies at least 4 things. Being righteous, being imputed or transfer the life of Jesus in our life. That's what makes us righteous. When he comes out of the graveside, all of his obedience, all of his submission to the scriptures, to the law, to the covenant, he submitted, he fulfilled that. It's given to us, imputed. That implies that legally we are fully innocent because we're forgiven. Legally, he sees us as somebody that has never sinned. So not only forgiven, but he looks at us through the life and the performance of Jesus. The question is, did Jesus sin? And the answer is obviously no. That lack of sinning, the absence of sinning is given to us. So this is why God doesn't simply look at us through the lenses of being forgiven, which is important. But now we are being perceived, seen as someone that has never sinned. Number 3, this is extremely important. All of them are important. But this number 3 implies that also, not only that we are fully or legally innocent, legally, I have never sinned, you have never sinned. That's the way you're perceived from a legal perspective. But number 3 is that God looks at us as if we have obeyed the entire Bible. God looks at us as if we have obeyed the entire Bible. Why? Because remember, when Jesus came out of the graveside, when he came out of that on that Sunday morning, he imputed, he transferred, he accredited his obedience to the Bible. So that obedience to the Bible places us legally from the perspective that we have fulfilled the entire law, although we haven't, right? We haven't, but positionally, from a perspective of a legal component, we have. And since we have, now we possess. So we're positioned, and then we start possessing. And that's the obedience that we have to exercise. So the obedience that we're exercising, the way we are growing and moving and continue to move, is based on what has taken place, what has happened to us. The number 4, which is probably also, again, equally important, but this a celebration, is that number 4 is that not only fully or legally forgiven, fully or legally, like we have never sinned, and then as if we have obeyed the entire Bible. Number 4 is basically that we are legally children of the Most High. We belong to our Heavenly Father. Our big brother is Jesus, and he performed, and his performance has been given to us. So that implies that when we sin, based on those 4 things, when we sin because we want to, not because we have to. When we disobey because we want to, not because we have to. Without Christ, you don't have a choice. You have to sin and you have to disobey. In our case, we got to make sure that we are following, exercising the righteousness, the fullness, the wholeness, the worldview of Jesus, the feelings of Jesus. They do reside within us. That's my point. They do reside within us. And one day we will give an account because we are stewards of those things that we are describing. Okay, possible reasons this book was written. Briefly over this, and then I'm going to finish after this. We're going to have to close Job next week. 3 theological issues collide in Job: God's goodness and fairness, Job's innocence, and the 2 ways doctrine. Remember the blessing and the cursing that we spoke about earlier. The opening prose section highlights Job's exemplary life and his terrible sufferings. And this contrast, right? Here you have a righteous individual going through the deepest of suffering. The best men suffer the most severe tragedies. In light of this, one of the 3 issues must be true and the others false, or at least half true. The question is, which one? The 3 issues that we just listed. In light of this, I think the main issue of the book is A, and I'm going to come back so we can remember what's A: God's goodness and fairness. That's the issue that he's describing in there. All right, to clarify the traditional covenantal theology, the 2 ways that we're describing, that the righteous are blessed in this life and the wicked are punished in this life. Traditional Jewish theology is communicated by the dialogue with Job's 3 friends. And again, you guys, again, I hope that you guys know a little bit of the story, or you can go back and read. We're just going through this on a very, again, survey format, so we don't have time to stop into the details. It is also interesting to note that the challenge to traditional thought in the fact that a young man like Eliyahu publicly refutes and corrects both Job and his 3 older friends. The issue of human suffering is surely an important aspect of this philosophical drama epic. This is not the world God intended to be. The fall, Genesis 3, has consequences. Many modern struggles with the natural disasters, human wickedness, and the diseases of this world. How did this fit into a revelation of a good, all-powerful, all-knowing God? How do you make sense of all this? That's kind of the question. How do you make sense? Well, like so many critical theological issues, the Old Testament, listen to this, the Old Testament starts the conversation, but thank God for the progressive and fuller revelation of the New Testament. The implication is that the Old Testament is not wrong, it's just incomplete, especially when you find yourself wondering this. If there is such a God who is good, who is powerful, how do you explain X, Y, and Z? Well, once again, the way you explain it, the way you process this is through the entire counsel of God. And the entire counsel of God begins, guess what? With doctrine. In other words, what you don't want to do is find yourself in this scenario, in a situation that you're wondering about God and his faithfulness and his character, his existence, or whatever the case may be. You're at a crossroads, and all that you have known, you're coming from a background where all that you have been exposed when it comes to the Bible, when it comes to the teaching, to the preaching of the Bible, is that your pastor, your mentor, your whatever, father, whoever has been discipling you has been focusing on what to do in the midst of this. Because again, as much as we are called to do things in the midst of this, and when the question is present, is real, is something that you are tangibly needing an answer to that, I'm telling you, I don't think the answer is found on what you need to do. I think the answer is found on understanding that the many critical theological issues of the Old Testament are filtered through the New Testament, in both testaments through the person of Jesus. All that I'm saying is that what you want to do is when you find yourself, when you are going through something like this, and when life hits you, when it becomes tangible and real, what you want to do, you want to make sure that your worldview, your feelings, your thoughts, your emotions, your lifestyle is grounded not on what you need to do, but on what God has done. And that's called doctrine. That's called the scriptures. That's called Jesus, because Jesus is what God has done, right? Jesus is what happened to us. And again, this is the message that we introduce Sunday after Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. This is the message that we try to avoid, that to have sermons or teaching that is focused on what you need to do. Because I'm going to say that again. Once you know what God has done, you fully understand and you're fully convinced to build your life and to build your disciplines, to build your habits, your lifestyle, your obedience, your going, your reaction, your grief, your loss, whatever you may find yourself, you grounded on what is unshakable. And that is doctrine. That is the scriptures. That is what God has done. So if or when in this scenario, you may find yourself unfaithful, you may find yourself struggling with faith, or struggling with unfaithfulness, or struggling with whatever you're struggling. Watch this. You are not building your life on your faithfulness. You build your struggle, you build and you deal with your whatever is going on, whatever it is that you never thought you'll face, you build it and you found it, you ground it on what God has done. Because ultimately, it's going to be the same question that was asked at the very beginning of the conversation. When you came to know Christ, and if you've never known Christ, you're going to listen to this question, because here's the question that was asked at the very beginning, and it's going to be asked today, and it's going to be asked tomorrow. Would you trust me? That's the question. Would you trust me? Would you trust me? For some of us, really, the answer is, I believe, help my unbelief. For some of us, is that we're at the place that we used to trust. And right now, I'm not exactly sure if I trust. I just don't know. And this is why this ability to trust is a gift given by God, given by the Holy Spirit. So if anybody has never put their trust in Jesus Christ, this is the perfect time to simply say, I don't fully understand. Maybe I do. I don't know. Whatever you find yourself, but you're having that ability to simply say, I trust you. I depend on you. I'm holding on to what you have said. And as a pastor, as a Bible teacher, whatever you may find yourself, in this process, let's just make that commitment that from this point forward, we're going to let and allow the text to determine discernment. Because ultimately, when your family and my congregation and our society goes through this type of questions, they need to know the scriptures. So they need to know what God has said, what God has done. So eventually they're going to find out what they need to do when they find themselves in whatever sphere, scenario, stage in life they might find themselves in the present, in the future, or whatever took place in the past. I do hope that this is making sense. We are going to stop right here. And again, I love to hear if you guys have any comments or questions up to this point. Otherwise, I'd love to have you guys connect and join next week. But does anybody have any questions, comments? Talk to me. I love to open up those mics for a few minutes before we go. It's 8 o'clock for me in the evening. Talk to me. Questions, comments.
Yeah, Vidal. Where can I go to find the previous live streams that we've done for the week 1 and 2? Were they recorded?
They were, brother, but I apologize, but I have been out of town so much that I have not uploaded them. But I am going to upload them because I'm going to my last trip of the year, and then I'm gonna upload them. But yeah, I will put them on YouTube and have them ready. They both have been recorded. This is our third one, which is also recorded, and we'll put them on YouTube.
Thank you.
No problem, brother. Anybody else? Any comments? Any questions before we go? Talk to me.
Yeah, I thought tonight's teaching was excellent, and it really ministered to me because in the book of Job, going through things in my life which were ordained by God, I got to the point where I'm no longer angry with God. I understand the fear of God. And through the book of Job, I began to say, I don't understand. I just don't understand, but I trust you because I know your character. I know your faithfulness. I know how good you are. I know you have my best interest. I know you love me. And so when I don't understand, I'm able to stand because of your character and who you are. And I've come to that point in my life. So this was very good for me tonight.
Well, it's what the Bible does for us, right? And and I should have said what I'm about to say right now. I should have said this earlier, but this description that you just gave as understanding or simply trusting that obviously God is for us, not against us. I will say that this is the result of two primary components. In other words, how do you get to that place where you're not angry with God anymore, or you don't feel deceived by God, or whatever the case may be, whatever you may find yourself in that, and you get to the place where now you are coming back to say, hey, I trust you. I will say is the intervention of two things. Number one, now I'm implying that the individual is saved. So if the person has never known Christ, we have a deeper problem, because that person, the issue is not that the individual is confused or the individual is hurt. The issue of that individual is that the judgment of God is coming over that life, right? So that life needs to be redeemed by Jesus, period. That's the bottom line, right? It begins with salvation. But assuming that we are saved, how we get to that place that you're describing, I will say that is two things. Number one is the fullness of the Holy Spirit, is the mastering, the lordship, and I want to use the word dominance, but I know it sounds negative, but is that fullness of the Spirit of God conducting our thoughts, navigating our feelings, Paul uses the analogy in Ephesians 5:18 of do not get drunk with wine where there is debauchery, but instead be filled with the Holy Spirit. So it is that constant filling of the Spirit, which, by the way, I don't think you can experience, and this is the second one, I don't think you can experience the fullness of God individually. I think you can be filled personally, but it's in the context of community. Because apparently this fullness of the Spirit is something that it's like drunkenness for the individual. This is the analogy of Ephesians 5:18. For the individual to remain drunk, it needs to continue to drink. So for the Christian to remain full of the Spirit, I'm not speaking of the seal of the Spirit. That's salvation. So salvation, my understanding is that you don't lose salvation. So that's the sealing. You belong to Jesus. The challenge is, how do I live life as if I belong to Jesus when Jesus seems to be absent, when Jesus seems to be against me, or at least I feel that he's against me, you know all those things. So again, I'm speaking of the fullness of the Spirit, the filling of the Holy Spirit, which is a daily experience. Just like if someone was to stay drunk, you need to drink every day, because the moment you stop drinking, you'll become sober and you lose your drunkenness. I think that's exactly what happens. So again, so it's the fullness of the Spirit plus community, church. That's how you get to that place. That's my understanding. And that's why anytime that I see a Christian that looks at church as negotiable or conditional or circumstantial, yeah, I think that Christian simply what he's saying is, I'm okay with simply being sealed by the Spirit, the sealing of the Spirit. I don't need the fullness of the Spirit. I'm okay. I got this. I can figure this one out. I'm old enough, seasoned enough, experienced enough, and then you go back into autonomy, self-sufficiency, and the rest, we know how that ends. So again, those two things, fullness of the Spirit, and then also the component of community.